September 27th, I was talking yesterday about being in Blaine, Washington after coming back from Canada. So I was basically, I think what I want to talk about is some of the things that Washington State was still doing while I was in Birch Bay. I made several calls to CPS trying to make arrangements to visit my son, and they stalled and refused to provide a bus pass. They kept trying to force me to move back to Wenatchee, and I knew that I had a legal right to stay in an area outside of Wenatchee. So they basically stalled for a month and a half. They made my son suffer and not see me for an entire month, which I don't believe is conducive to retaining and keeping the parental bond, which CPS is required to do. The entire case was a fraud to begin with, to cover up for the crimes of kidnapping my son from me. However, if we even pretend for a moment that it was a normal CPS case and they were offering certain things that they are required by law to offer. They are required by law to preserve the parental-child bond, unless after all remedies have been exhausted, there appears to be no hope whatsoever, and they then will terminate the parental rights. This is usually for very severe situations where the parent is completely incapable of caring for the child and would do very serious damage and harm to a child. So while the objective is to keep the parental child between the mother or parent and or parental bond between the mother and the child, I should say parent and child as well, because also fathers are affected by CPS. Everything that I've seen from CPS has been a lie. I really feel that of all of the different organizations that receive taxpayer money, I believe that CPS should be the first one to be cut. The reason I say that is because everything that I've seen from CPS has been that they act in a criminal way towards children, and that they are actually facilitating crimes against children and not protecting children. That is not to say that there are not some situations where CPS has intervened on behalf of children and helped them. And it's also not to say that there are some situations where CPS should have intervened and didn't, and a child died because of that. However, it's really not, if something is that severe, it's not the prerogative of CPS to be doing that kind of work. It would be the prerogative of police to investigate that kind of a thing, because if a child is in that kind of danger, that's a crime. That is something that the police need to investigate, not a child protective services agency that can roll things under the rug or a carpet. Prior to, I believe, I have done a lot of research on so many different things, and I have a lot of this common knowledge that has accumulated in my mind, but I don't remember always the exact dates. However, I did research on the development of this organization of Child Protective Services, which is under the umbrella of the Child and Family Services Department, or Children and Family Services Department, which is in Washington, D.C. The development of Child Protective Services came about in, I think it was 1960s or 1970s. And it may have been as late as the 1970s. Prior to that, anything having to do with children was managed by either police, if there was a criminal problem or any kind of negligence towards the care of children, and adjunctively the Social Security Department. And Social Security was basically not only protected the rights of the elderly, but was also tasked with the authority to protect the rights of children. So that the quote-unquote the Social Security was to secure protection for the elderly when and people when they are going into retirement, to secure the protection and rights of children should parents die and there's no one to take care of them and they become a ward of the state, so then they go to orphanages and they manage the adoption processes and that kind of thing. And that was basically the role of Social Security. What happened is that if there was a problem with the child, or with the care of a child, the police were the group to investigate that, because they would investigate crimes against a child just as they would investigate crimes against an adult. So there was no separate category or policing for children with some other agency that's really composed of a bunch of women who've either had their hair in curlers too long or have absolutely zero experience with child development and kids themselves at all, and thought that they could get a degree at a university and that was good enough. So it's like, basically you've got a bunch of women who are like the lunch ladies, and they think that they know everything about other people's children, and they also think that they are police. They assume that they have the rights of police and that they can perform investigative duties, but they can't. They are not trained in the same way that a detective is trained, and their objectives are too divided, and their motives are not sound, and I will explain why that is. So, prior to, as I was saying, prior to CPS, we had a system that did not ignore abuses of children at all. We responded to any kind of crime against children, and we involved detectives and law enforcement in that. If it rose to that level, that is the appropriate authority that would take charge of such a thing. And then the other group that got involved was Social Security, which ran the orphanages. So in the most extreme situations, they basically provided funding for that and sponsored any kind of attempt to then find a new family for the child that didn't have one or was abandoned or for whatever reason. So that system had worked for many years, and actually there really was not a problem with it. And what happened is that all of a sudden we saw this new department being proposed, and again, I'm trying to remember if it was the 60s, late 60s, or the 70s. But at the same time that MK Ultra, the government MK Ultra program, was basically rearing its ugly head, that is the same time that someone came up with the idea of creating a department where the government, the United States government, could assume guardianship of a child before there was any extreme danger. So, for example, the government wanted to get their hands on kids. for research, for experimentation, for top secret programs that no parent would allow their child to be part of. There is no way that, and the United States already felt that they were a little bit behind Russia and China and some other countries where maybe, no offense to China or Russia, I don't believe they will take any offense with my saying this, but where it seems, or at least over here in the United States, we hear that maybe their governments could just kind of pick kids out, and maybe there's not as much freedom or free will or that kind of thing. So I have this impression, as most people might, that in Russia or China you don't always get to choose what you want to do, and the government chooses for you, for the welfare of the entire country, that kind of thing, which is, what we hear is like the bad thing about communism. Well, the United States has done the exact same thing, and in order to, quote-unquote, keep up with the other countries, they decided, well, there is nobody, there is no parent in their right mind that is going to allow their child to be tortured or experimented and researched on. If there were a few of them. There were a few that maybe did this for patriotic reasons or whatever reasons they felt it should be done, but they didn't have enough. And by creating this department that would cover up and conceal for the top secret programs that the government wanted to use against children, and trying to make it look like it was an agency that was in the best interests of children, it was a brilliant idea. This is probably one of the most groundbreaking ideas in all of military and CIA research to date. I mean, back then, to date. It was perfect. It was the perfect glove to fit this this hand that the government wanted to have on kids. So they basically, at that point, the government was able to start using children before and even in the absence of crimes against children. So where before the only way that the government could get involved with a child was if the parents died and there was no one to take this child or care for them, or if there was a serious crime against the child where the police would be involved. Now the government was lowering the threshold of standard to, well, if there's any suspicion, if there's any idea that there might be negligence, if we think this, if we think that, they lowered the standard to where anybody could make an accusation against a family, and potentially, if people lined their ducks up right, it gave the government leverage to go in and steal a child from that family and say that, well, we have some concerns and we'd like you to go through services, and no, you haven't committed a crime, and we don't have any evidence of crime against a child, but we're concerned about the child's welfare. So suddenly you have parental rights getting minimized to almost absolute rights of the parent, and right to pursuit of happiness and to have their child and family with them and raise this child the way they feel is best for their family. You have this absolute right, almost absolute rights of the child and the parents being, which is great scope to being minimized to, this. Basically now it's, the government does not only just take a child away if there's a crime. The government takes the child away if there is a dirty house, if there is an accusation that someone might be mentally ill, and yet there's no diagnosis, but we think, well, maybe there is a problem, so we'll use that as our excuse for taking this child away. So basically, it's no longer a matter of police investigating crimes against children. You have CPS, quote unquote, managing these kinds of things. And the problem with that is that, number one, they just lowered the standard of parental and child rights.